Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to make some handmade Halloween cards using a couple products from the new Hocus Pocus collection from Hero Arts. So first we have this Tricks and Treats stamp set, some adorable Halloween images. It does have a coordinating stamp set that it works with. I don't have that one, but I do have this witch's hat die, which I absolutely love. I think it's awesome. First, I'm going to start with heat embossing some of my stamped images. Now, anytime I have a new stamp set, especially clear acrylic stamps that I'm going to be using, the first thing I do before even trying the stamp set is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It removes any manufacturing residue that might be there, and it does help your stamps take the ink a little bit better. Now, obviously, dye stamps still won't take the ink quite as well because of the acrylic and just the nature of those two together, but I'm using a Misti stamping tool, so anytime I'm using dye ink with it, I can stamp it a couple times to make sure I get a nice clear image. However, today I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. So I'm starting off with the cauldron stamp as well as one of the sentiment stamp sets. I'm working on distress watercolor cardstock. I want to do watercoloring for these images, so you do need watercolor cardstock or something that can handle that moisture. I start with a little bit of embossing powder tool over my surface just to make sure that that embossing powder is only going to stick to the VersaMark ink that I'm using. I ink my stamp with VersaMark ink, and I typically do it a couple times just to make sure that I have a nice clear image. You can see the ink if you look from the side. It'll shine in the light. It's definitely hard to see on camera because it is clear ink. Once you make sure that you have a nice clear image, you can pour the embossing powder on top of there. So I'm using some silver embossing powder for this, and then I melt that embossing powder using my heat tool. It's really easy to see when it's done. It goes from kind of a matte granular to a nice metallic shiny look. Then I'm going to add a couple more images. So I start with a little spell book that's in this stamp set, and then I have a crystal ball. Now there's also a stamp in there that has it's like a potion bottle. That would be great to use here as well. I actually didn't see that one when I grabbed the crystal ball, but that's okay. So I stamped that with the VersaMark ink as well. And for something a little bit different, I'm going to use black embossing powder on these ones. Typically, I don't mix different colors of embossing powder in the same image, but I wanted to see how it was going to look, and I thought it would look a little bit interesting. So after pouring that powder on there, making sure that there was no powder crystals where I didn't want them to be, I heat embossed that as well. Now we're going in with a second piece of watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to heat emboss the witch's hat, the broom, as well as another one of the sentiments. So I place them on my cardstock. The worst thing to me about using acrylic stamps, especially the teeny tiny ones, is they really like to stick to your fingers. So it's definitely harder to get them positioned properly. Now what I should have done here was straightened out my sentiment. I noticed when I was editing my video that my sentiment was not perfectly straight. I didn't actually notice it while I was doing it, but it looks, in my opinion, fairly obvious in the video. But again, I didn't notice it while I was doing it. The nice thing about the Misti is it does have those grid marks on the door of it, so you can check with those grid marks, and typically I do. I thought I did, but maybe I didn't. Or maybe it looked like it was even on the window, but in real life, it looks just a little bit crooked to me. So I'm embossing this one with the black embossing powder. Especially for that witch's hat, I thought it would be a really nice outline for that. Heating it up with my heat tool. And then there's also some sun and moon and stars stamps in this set. You could also add them in the background as well. I opted not to, but I think it would look nice and would work well with this as well. So I put it in here and then put my stamps around, and really this is when I decided that I thought it might be a little bit too much, so I opted not to do it. My plan was to do it and then heat emboss it with silver, so we're mixing embossing powder on that as well. Again, I just wanted to share that as an idea if you felt like using that. It's just a nice addition to that witch's hat and the broom. I realized as I was doing that there's some bubble stamps for the cauldron that I hadn't added. So I stamped those with that VersaMark ink and then put that silver embossing powder on there and heat embossed those as well. I only stamped it one time. You could absolutely do it more than once if you wanted to. I didn't want to overkill my image with too much stamping and embossing. So I opted just to be a little bit more minimal with it. Now my plan here is to watercolor them with Distress watercolor crayons. These have a little bit of a more matte finish to them. They're a little bit more opaque. They're it depends on how much water you add. You get some transparency if there's little pigment and a lot of water, or you can keep using or keep wetting that paint and get it darker. Anytime I'm watercoloring, I start with the area I want my color to be darkest, and then as I'm pulling my brush out or painting with my brush out, it gets more water with that paint, and the paint gets naturally just a little bit lighter, so you get some natural highlights and shading in there. I have a piece of paper towel to my right side, so anytime I want to clean off my brush, I can just squeeze that brush and water will flush through the bristles and clean my brush. So the water in this brush is in the handle. This is perfect for people like me that tend to be little klutzes. If I had an open jar of water on my desk, there's a very good chance I would spill it. So this is perfect for me. I have had this brush for many, many years. I want to say we're going on to 10-15 years by now. It's been a really long time. I absolutely love it. I used some black soot for the cauldron as well as the witch's hat, and I'm now going in with some Villainous Potion. These are both from set number 1 of the Distress Crayon set. I'm using set number 1 and set number 2. I tried to keep the sets I was using to a minimum, but I definitely wanted that black, and I wanted the green that was in set number 2 as well as the fossilized amber in set number 2. So after we do the Villainous Potion for the book as well as the band on the hat, I go in and use some walnut stain from set number 1 for the base of the crystal ball as well as the handle for the broomstick. The color in my little crystal ball there is just the black with a lot of water to it, so it looks more gray. Again, I didn't want to include more sets or add more sets, especially when it's really easy to take that black and turn it into gray by just making sure it's really diluted. Then we go in with the set number 2. I'm using Twisted Citron. It's a nice bright green, and I figured it would work really, really well for a potion in that cauldron. I also decided to use it as the background for this particular card. It worked perfectly for that background, and I think it makes it kind of spooky, kind of eerie, kind of bubbly with the potion. Now, I do wish that I had used this green as the brim of the hat, because I end up deciding to use the Villainous Potion for the background. And even with just that purple and the black on the hat, there's not a whole lot of contrast to it. So I would definitely suggest a color that has a lot more contrast to the black than that Villainous Potion. Even an orange would be perfect for it. It would have a lot more contrast to the black than the color that I ended up choosing. So when I'm doing my background here, I didn't want my entire background color covered. I wanted the concentration of ink on the background of the image and then kind of going out to nothing. So that's what I did there, and then I can let that dry for a moment while I'm working on the other image. I'm using that fossilized amber for the straw on the broom, and then I decided I wanted a little bit of orange in that crystal ball just to add a little bit more color to it. So I grabbed the orange, and I didn't write which one it was. It's in the set number 2, so I just grabbed that just to add a little bit more color. I really love the orange and green and purple combination with Halloween cards, especially when combined with black. I think it just it's just a fun combination. So for my background for the witch's hat and broom, I wanted it to kind of look like a misty, eerie sky. So I wanted to do it in Villainous Potion. I accidentally grabbed Seedless Preserves to start. So when you see me do it to start, it's a different color tone, and then I go over it. The Villainous Potion or the distress crayons, when you're working for and doing a background, it gets a little bit streaky. You can't see it on the Twisted Citron on my first card because it's such a light, bright color, but you definitely see it on the second one here. What would work better is using Villainous Potion Distress Refill as a background. I find that I don't get quite as much of streakiness as I did with this. I kept working at it, and the streaks just didn't get better. So they stay on there. I also, if there wasn't such a light color for that broom, I would have taken the Villainous Potion Distress Pad and gone over that background just to kind of mute some of those streaks there. But you can see me working, trying to even it out. And as I was working, it was not evening out, as well as the fact that I could tell that that paper was starting to not really like how much I was working it, even though it's watercolor paper. was just not taking it really well. So at one point I decided to end it, but I just wanted to address the streaky background there. It's not, in my opinion, the worst ever, but it's definitely not the best background I've done. I definitely prefer when those backgrounds are a lot more even. I really love the way the one turned out for the cauldron, but not as much of a fan as of the witch's hat background there. So I wanted to add a little bit of sparkle to that background. So I'm using some splatter effects. I'm using it in both the Raven, which is the black, as well as the sparkle. So the Raven is black and it has a gold shimmer to it. The sparkle is like a whitey silver color, kind of a pearl color, and it has more of a silver shimmer to it. So I'm just adding splatters to the background, and then I go in, because the splatter effects has like a nail polish brush, I go in and paint over top of the liquid that's in the cauldron as well as the bubbles, and then I decide to go wild and go over top of the crystal ball as well. I figured the sparkle, the shimmer from it would be perfect for all of those elements. So I let that dry for just a few moments, and then I go in and start to trim my papers down for my card. I'm creating A2 cards here. I already have mats cut for my cards out of black cardstock. They are trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. So these pieces here, I'm doing 1/4 inch off of each edge, making them 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So as I'm working, I thought maybe the purple on my background would get a little bit more subtle as it dried. So what I should have done here was taken a Villainous Potion pad and just done a little bit of ink blending around the edges. That I think would have kind of muted the streakiness a little bit, because I was counting on it to, I thought I was being my own worst critic, but in hindsight, looking at it afterwards, again, I don't love the way the background turned out. I'm sharing this just to share some ways to fix that, because I find that that's helpful. Sometimes I come up with solutions while I'm creating, and sometimes afterwards I'm like, I should have done that. I think we're all like that a little bit, and I do like to share some of the ways that I would change it for next time, especially if I'm not particularly loving how it turned out. For a little bit of extra texture, I'm adding some glossy accents. I'm doing it in the center of that cauldron for that potion, on the bubbles, and also on the magic ball. Then I'm going in and just adding it to the band on the witch's hat. Now, once again, if that band was a brighter color, I think it would show off just a little bit more, but I love how the glossy accents just add that extra little bit of texture. When you tilt it into the light, it just has that beautiful gloss to it, and you still see the shimmer from the sparkle effects that I painted on there afterwards. So with those cards done, I've got my glossy accents set aside, or my pieces with the glossy accents set aside to completely dry. They were mostly dry for that last clip, but they'll dry just a little bit more. I'm ready to start assembling my witch's hat. Now I'm going to make 2 cards with this. I'm doing one as a witch's hat, and then I'm doing a second one. I kind of thought the shape of this witch's hat, it reminded me of the scarecrow's hat in The Wizard of Oz. So I'm doing a second one with a completely different color palette, just to kind of play with that, because I thought it would look really nice as a scarecrow hat as well. For this one though, I have that hat cut out of Raven cardstock. I have the bow and the band cut out of Rainforest and Fern cardstock, as well as Rainforest and Fern used for some of the greenery. Then for the flowers for this particular card, I have some violet cardstock as well as Sicily. Sicily is like an orange, but it has a pink tone to it. So it's a fun way to get that Halloween palette, but with just a little bit of a different color tone to it because of that bit of pink tone. I like it for something just a little bit different. The flowers are really, really easy to put together. There is a large one and a small one of the front view of the flower. For this particular card, I layered a small one on top of a big one so that there was a couple layers to each one of those cards. Now to change it up, you could use a couple color tones. So I could use 2 different tones of purple and 2 different tones of orange if I wanted the same color palette, but just a little bit of color variation. And then there's some side views of flowers. They have very simple stems to them. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I just put a dot of glue on the bottom of that stem, and then, or on the bottom of that bud, and then put the stem right on top of that. I like using that liquid glue when I'm assembling things because it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place while you're working. You'll notice as I work, often I'll move and adjust things as I'm working, and that liquid glue gives you the ability to do that. I also like to work from back to front when I'm working on things like this. So I started off with some greenery that I wanted in the back, and then I used some lighter greenery that I wanted just a little bit in the forefront of that. Then I'm going in with those little side buds of flowers. Because I have just two colors here, I try to make sure that the same color isn't beside each other. I try to vary it a little bit so that we don't have a cluster of all orange flowers together or purple flowers all together. But by using that liquid glue, it gives me that wiggle room and that flexibility to move things around. One of the ways I like to add a little bit of extra dimension when I'm creating is by using my fingers to curve the petals of flowers. It doesn't add a ton of dimension, but just a little bit, and I think it takes it to the next level. I don't add any support behind those pieces, so if we were to like press something down really flat, those would flatten. But these are typically cards that I would hand out to someone. If I'm going to go through this much work on a project, I would hand it to someone in person. So to finish off my flowers here, I'm going to use some Aura Gems. These have a little bit of a yellow tone to them, but they also have a little bit of opalescence to them. So they really tie in beautifully with the colors that are already there, but the yellow really gives it a beautiful fall tone. For the background of this card, I'm just using some hammermill cardstock. I have it trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And then I chose one of the sentiments from that Tricks and Treats stamp set. I'm stamping it with some black ink. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. You could, if you wanted to add a little bit of extra texture here, you could do heat embossing with that sentiment, but I wanted that witch's hat to be the focus. So I have an A2 card base here. My mat is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And you can see that on that mat piece, that's the part that I used to die cut the base of that witch's hat. I knew I was going to be putting a piece of cardstock over top of it, and you can't see through the cardstock, so no one would ever know that anything was cut out of it, but it's a great way to extend your cardstock just a little bit and have it go a little bit longer. So after the piece with the sentiment is glued down, I can glue down that hat there, and we have a gorgeous finished card. And I love the extra texture that those gems add to the centers of those flowers. It really catches the light and makes it sparkle. And it's just a way to really kind of elevate a witch's hat. For the last card here, this is the one that I'm going to be doing or using to create my scarecrow card. So I have my witch's hat die cut out of some beeswax cardstock. I'm using the linen embossing folder in order to add some texture to it. It's going to make it a little bit more, or look a little bit more like burlap or like a woven fabric. And then I'm using some vintage photo distress ink with a large Spellbinders ink blending brush to ink around it, kind of making it look a little bit dingy looking. My mat for my card, or my base piece for my card here, is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I'm just using a bit of that same vintage photo distress ink in order to ink around it, just to add and tie in the ink blending on the hat. So with that ink blending done, I'm ready to start assembling the band, the bow, and the flowers and greenery to my hat. For this one, I chose some acorn cardstock as well as truffle cardstock for the band and the bow. The acorn is just a little bit lighter than that truffle, so it just gives a little bit of visual dimension to it. All of the greenery for this particular card is die cut out of some Fern cardstock, so it's just a nice dark green, and I thought it would show off well on that beeswax cardstock. My flowers for this one are cut out of Sicily cardstock, wildberry, and carrot cardstock, so they've got a real autumn feel to it. For this one, I changed up the flowers, and rather than glue a smaller one on top of a larger one, I die cut a few extra ones, and so I have some small flowers and large flowers. All of them have double layers to them, but it just gives that extra little bit of dimension and the difference in size between the flowers. The smaller ones, I didn't worry about shaping the petals at all, but the larger one I did. And then I took some of the greenery, some of the leaves, and just inserted it in some areas that I thought needed to be broken up from the colors of the flowers. And you can see while I'm doing that, I'm also adjusting those flowers. And by having that liquid glue on them, it makes it really easy to do that. And I don't have to worry about pulling things apart because I know that glue hasn't quite set yet. So I have a little bit of flexibility with it. I also change up the arrangement for this one because I changed the flowers. I'm also inserting some of the greenery below the flowers for this one, whereas the last one I didn't. I left it all above that bow and that band, but this one, it goes down just a little bit as well. The other way I'm changing it up is I'm still using those Aura gems, but I have a little bit larger one in the large flower, and then I'm using smaller ones in the smaller flower. And again, it just ties all those colors up really well. It ties the fall colors for the fall palette in really nicely, but it catches that light when you tilt it into the light, and I think it just finishes off those flowers beautifully. Now, if you didn't want to use the gems, there is dies in that witch's hat die set for the centers of the flowers, but I typically love to use either gems or stickles in the center just for that extra little bit of texture. I chose one of the sentiments from the Tricks and Treats stamp set to stamp on the bottom, and I stamped that with that Vintage Photo Distress ink. I use my Misti stamping tool when I'm stamping things like that because I can stamp it multiple times and make sure that I get a nice clean image and I don't have to worry about having to fix something if I don't. For the mat for this, I used the beeswax cardstock that was left over from cutting my witch's hat. And once again, that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches with my inner mat that I did the ink blending on cut to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I kept my layout for this card the same as the witch's hat card, but you could easily change it up, say put the sentiment at the top and have the hat more towards the bottom. But I really liked that layout of it. I wanted that hat to be the focal point and the sentiment to kind of be a secondary factor to it. And I just love how that scarecrow hat turned out with that embossing for that extra bit of texture, as well as the fall color palette. Then we have our witch's hat with some fall colors with it, but completely different from the scarecrow one. Then we have our watercolor cards. The first one here is that cauldron one with that nice bright lime background. And then our witch's hat and broom with that purpley background that, as I've shared before, is not my favorite, but I wanted to share it anyways and the ways that I would change it up. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.